When looking at the history of toys, there are one or two toys that really stand out. For dolls, they're dollhouses. For action figures, they're called playsets. At the end of the day, they represent homes for toys to play in. A place to bring to life not only the toys themselves, but the entire world, the entire environment of a toy. My name is Scott ToyGuru Neitlich. I'm your host on Spectra Creative. I've been in the toy industry for about 25 years, but I'm also a collector and a father, and that's given me a unique perspective. And today we're going to look at one of the greatest playsets of all time, but first, a quick history of playsets. So what we think of as the playset did start as the dollhouse, or as it was called, the Dolkenhuis, which is Dutch for miniature house, not dollhouse. But it got turned into dollhouse later on with the Englishization. And these were from the 17th century. Later on in the 1800s, they became what's called a baby house, which was designed not for play, but they were literal recreations of a person's house, and they were meant to show off wealth and status and say, look at my house in miniature form, isn't it awesome? Well, fast forward to the 20th century, and we started to see what would eventually become the modern playset. So, in the 1950s, of course, you had little army men, and little army men got little cardboard army men adventure sets, or little dinosaurs. In the 1960s, got, dinosaur caves to play in. And this was really starting to emphasize that toys could play in an environment, not just display. What really changed the game was Fisher-Price in the 1960s and 70s with their Little People line. They actually had entire houses and environments with play features and furniture and cars to actually bring the figures to life, and it was part of what was called the play pattern. You couldn't just play with the figures alone. There were other toys in the 60s and 70s that started to get the playset treatment, and of course influenced by those early Dolkenhuises for displaying toys. They tended to be vertically tall and have big open spaces for displaying your figures. Sometimes you would get what we would call today action features. Of course, there's the famous Mego Star Trek set with the transporter. But for the most part, early playsets in the 70s were based on that old model of displaying toys with a little bit of play value, as opposed to, the Fisher-Price, which absolutely had play value, but those were for younger kids, toddlers, if you will, once you got to the older boy. Then along comes the 1980s, the golden age of the action figure playset. This is where we got things like G.I. Joe's aircraft carrier, the USS Flag, so big it was designed to go under a child's bed. And of course, Kenner also led the way with the real Ghostbusters firehouse, with lights and sounds and a flagpole. I mean, every action figure needs a flagpole to go down, right? And who can forget the Thundercats cat lair, which had the main hero's base from the animated series come alive in living rooms? The Ewok Village, one of the most memorable parts of Return of the Jedi for those who forget about the Jabba the Hutt part. And of course, the Ewok Village from Kenner was also memorable because it was re-released a few years later by Kenner as Sherwood Forest for the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves set. It's one of the things I love about the Robin Hood line, was all the reuse of previous Kenner parts. So yeah, you could buy your Ewok Village redone. And of course, who doesn't have amazing memories about Castle Zendo, the multi-level environment? Okay, really can't be serious about this one. I have no idea about it. I've never heard of that set before. But the set I really want to talk about today is the king of all 1980s playsets, Castle Grayskull, for the Masters of the Universe brand from Mattel. Now, I was the brand manager for Masters of the Universe for about 10 years, not in the vintage era, but in modern times for the classics line. And while a lot of us think of Castle Grayskull from the animated series, from Filmation, it had a very interesting story and origin and life before Filmation. Obviously, the Masters of the Universe line was released 2 years before the Filmation series, and Castle Grayskull was part of the launch wave, meaning it was part of the initial offering when you had 8 figures a castle, a battle cat, and then a few vehicles like the battle ram and the wind raider. And it came loaded. I mean, it had a ton of play features. It was one of the first play sets to really have that play feature concept, possibly inspired by the younger Fisher-Price sets aimed at a younger demographic, but now aimed at the older boy who had now graduated from Fisher-Price Little People to call it a big boy play set. I know I'm going to get stuff about that online, aren't I? I can already hear it. But yeah, weapons racks, ladders, train devices, trap doors. It was amazing. So the origin of Castle Grayskull actually starts with the origin of the line, the He-Man trio that Roger Sweet created. His original idea was more of a male Barbie that could be anything, space, military, etc. And all of the different looks were going to come from the Well of Souls. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. They were going to come from a portal, some other place that was that's how the He-Man character was going to travel. Well, the Well of Souls concept was just this portal renamed, and that came from Mark Taylor, who was the early artist on the line, who once Roger Sweet's concept was approved to move forward to development, Mark Taylor was brought on to start doing sketches, and he did quite a few sketches of castles. The original one, the very first one, was called the Well of Souls, and it's the image you're looking at here. And this was, obviously, it wasn't called Castle Grayskull, it was called the Well of Souls. And the idea was the castle, instead of the portal being in the sky, it was going to be under the castle. And it was represented in the prototype by this mat you see under the castle. This was the literal Well of Souls that Castle Grayskull was sitting on top of, that could spew out things from any dimension and any adventure, and it was essentially the source of the storytelling, which came from Roger Sweet's original concept of it just being a sky portal. And much like the final release, the castle was chock full of items. Some of the items didn't make it to the final, such as the jetpack you see kind of in the middle left there, and the torture rack on the bottom right. You can understand why Mattel got rid of a torture rack. But for the most part, it did make it exactly to retail. This is a slide I created internally at Mattel showing the differences between the prototype and the final. The crown on the top, the elongated jaw, the ledge. There were a few features that had to get shrunk back in order to make it fit in the box. So yeah, that jaw, the top jaw had to get sort of pushed back a little. The ledge was lost, and the crown on the top, or the pawn, if you will, on top of the crown was eliminated. And this was all to make it fit in the box and to make it cost effective. And that moat, that play set mat that was going to represent the Well of Souls was eliminated. That would have been either part of the box or inserted in, and again, for cost reasons, it was removed. And it's kind of sad because that represented so much of the imaginative play value. It did live on a little bit in the Dungeon Grate. The Dungeon Grate was definitely inspired by this playmat with the idea that there were all these things under the castle. And you could see that the early castle was dropped into the very first mini-comics because that was the only reference they had, was the prototype when the mini-comics were drawn. They didn't have the final, which had to get some of the features pushed back, shrunk down in order to be cost-effective and, more importantly, fit in the box, because the box had to be certain dimensions to fit at retail. Now, as I said, the castle did come with a ton of stuff. While, yeah, the jaw bridge was pushed back a little bit and the left side ledge and secret door were removed, you still had the laser gun and the weapon rack and these great cardboard cutouts, plus a ton of accessories. It was one of the first playsets that actually came with accessories that could go with the action figure line. So if you had He-Man and Man-at-Arms and Skeletor and Beastman, you could now arm them with more stuff, more axes, more laser guns. And the aforementioned cardboard cutouts, while it was a cost-saving maneuver, it really did help bring the castle to life with computers and robot suits, mixing that whole tech and medieval that became the big theme. And of course, the castle was all packaged in beautiful art by Rudy Obrero, who at that time didn't know who owned the castle and stuck Skeletor in the jaw bridge because he thought that the skull on the castle looked like Skeletor, so he figured Skeletor lived there. And that's why He-Man is attacking the castle in the box art. There was no story at that point, and that's just how Rudy interpreted the castle and drew it. The back, of course, used line art, which was very common in the 80s as a cost-saving maneuver because it really just had to explain to parents what else was available in the line, and doing one-color line art, in this case red on white, helped to do that in a very direct way. Now, eventually, we did do the castle in the Classics line, which is the line I worked off of. And we did try to pay homage to the prototype a lot more, adding back in things like the pawn and the ledge and elongating the mouth of the jaw bridge. We also struggled with size comparisons, much like the original, where we tried to make it as big as possible, but it also had to fit within a budget and within shipping dimensions. By the time we got a final model, it was a little bit smaller than the original cardboard cutout we used to sell it in. The idea was to be as close as possible. But we did get Rudy to do all new art, so the same artist did the art for the Classics Castle Grayskull as the vintage one. And we even let fans choose which characters were going to be on the box art, which I thought was a great way to involve them. And the Classics one also brought to life a lot of the items like the robot suit and the computer screen that were just represented as cardboard cutouts in the original. So this was kind of really the ultimate version of your childhood toy, now done to perfection. Of course, while I love the Classics toy, I also really love the Icon Heroes Castle Grayskull because it was based on the Classics toy but expanded to all four sides. It's a little expensive. It's small. It's made of resin. It's not a playset. It's a statue, but it's a really cool statue. All right. So Castle Grayskull. Why in the world is a green castle named Castle Grayskull? Well, this is why. Don Gloot. So Don Gloot is a sci-fi action fiction writer who also does a lot of movies, a lot of dinosaur stuff. He may be also very well known as the author of the Empire Strikes Back novelization from the 1980s, taking George Lucas's script and turning it into a book. So Don Gloot was brought on as a freelance writer on the original mini-comics, the first four. You can see Castle Grayskull there in the background, once again based on the prototype because that's all they had to draw the art with at the time. So Don was asked to write mini-comics specifically to feature all of the action and play features of the figures and the playsets. And he wound up doing 4 different mini-comics. Essentially, the storyline, you can see in other videos in the link above. They introduced some concepts that didn't make it that far past the first year, like the Green Goddess and He-Man being from a jungle tribe and having armor that gave him superpowers. But, needless to say, they're still fondly remembered. One of the things, though, that Don mentioned in a blog on his website is he was a little upset that he wasn't going to get byline credit. Meaning, if you open up kind of any comic book and you look at the title page, you will see the name of the story and then who wrote, drew it, inked it, etc. So these comics weren't in any way going to say by Don Gloot. They were just going to say by Mattel. And he wasn't too ecstatic about this, even though that's clearly what the contract said. He talks at length about this in his blog. And to kind of satisfy this need to get credit, what he did is characters that he named, like he gave the name to Tila as an example. She was just called the Warrior and the Goddess before Don came along. Well, he named her after an elephant. You can find out more about that in Which Elephant in the Tila video. And then when it came time to the castle, he was dating a woman named Linda Gray at the time. And when he was given an image of Castle Grayskull, it was in black and white. He had no idea it was green. So he named the castle Castle Grayskull after his girlfriend, because that was his way of kind of getting credit for the work he was doing, since his name would never appear anywhere. I mean, he did get a paycheck, which, should be credit. So while toys come and go, and, some of them do wind up in the outside by the curb at the end of the day, Castle Grayskull is one of those toys that lives forever. It is the king of 1980s playsets, and probably, honestly, one of the greatest playsets ever made. In a time when playsets just aren't really a big part of toy lines anymore for cost and logistic reasons, Castle Grayskull will remain one of the most memorable toys of all time. And I'm privileged to have gotten to work on a version of it. I feel very lucky, and I hope for everyone who had one, they do too. If you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe and give it a like, because that tells YouTube to share it with more people. And that's the whole point of this channel, is to share love for toys. So I appreciate that. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll see you around the toy aisle. I never had this one either.